Good morning. So now I'm assuming that I have your attention. I want you to just take a moment and reflect on what just happened. Because I'm quite confident, assuming you heard what I heard, that something happened. Something happened as you heard that particular sound. What typically happens for most people in an exercise like that, a brief 30-second exercise, is that some feelings are stirred up. Something happens when we hear the sound of a human infant. And it's important to bear in mind, human infants are incredibly incapable beings. They lack the ability to care for themselves until an astoundingly late period in life relative to other creatures. And yet one very powerful capability that human infants have is the ability to command our attention. And when we think about the sort of the evolutionary advantage of that's conferred upon us by the ability to raise our offspring in a wide range of environments, which is something, it has a lot to do with the fact that human infants take a long time to reach maturity and be able to care for themselves. You realize then that also confers upon us the responsibility to care for these delicate, fragile creatures. And as a consequence, we've evolved this quite elegant system whereby these delicate, fragile creatures who require our attention are capable of doing so. They're able to command our attention and often generate some really strong emotions in the process. So I want you to bear this in mind. This is a theme that we're going to return to. This is a vivid illustration of an idea that's really important as we link last week's class to this week's class. So with that, welcome to class 4, our class on emotion. Let me just take a moment and review some best practices related to Zoom and our work together in this context. Submit your questions during my remarks. While I'm talking, questions will occur to you. Please submit them. And at various intervals during the class, you'll go into a conversation with your partner. I'll review the questions and then be able to answer them by, in some cases, combining questions when I see a theme in the debrief after conversations with your partners. As I've noted in the last couple of weeks' announcements, the side-by-side mode in Zoom allows you, I think, to optimize the layout. My slides typically have relatively little text, so you can shrink the slides and increase the video if it's easier. Also, if you have any feedback, not only about the content, but also about the mechanics and using Zoom here, please send your input to this email. I promise to read everything. I may not be able to respond, but I will absolutely read. And the input I've gotten so far has already had a big impact on my ability to improve this class. Also, just a reminder, in your partner conversations, you're going to have to interact in real time during class, so be prepared to reach out to the person who you're taking this course with as a partner, in person, in phone, or on a separate video call. I would like you to experiment with the coaching process. Today, we're going to have 2 conversations. One is really just more sort of information sharing. So think of it more as a casual discussion. The second conversation, I really would like you to be deliberate and rigorous about a coaching process. There'll be an on-screen timer, crude one, but one that will help you stay on track and keep track of time. Here's an overview of our agenda. I'm going to have some remarks about the role of emotions, take about 15 minutes. Get you into that discussion, and then we'll come back and debrief, take about 20 minutes. I'll have some further remarks on emotion regulation, and then a coaching conversation with a second debrief, and I'll tee up next week's class with some remarks for next time. With that, here is the warm-up for this week. In this week's announcement, I asked you to prepare by reflecting on these questions. What are some of the emotions, positive and negative, that you've experienced as a result of COVID-19? And how do these feelings affect what you pay attention to? Again, noting the hinge between last week's class and this week's class, the relationship between attention and emotion. So I'd like you to take 6 minutes, discuss with your partner, what have I been feeling? You've got 3 minutes per person. I'll see you back here in 6 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Wherever you are, I'm going to have to ask you to hit pause in this conversation, and I'll be getting you back into a conversation with your partner briefly. But let me just take a few moments and build on the readings that I asked you to explore and talk about the role of emotion. I'm drawing here largely on the work of Antonio Damasio, a neuroscientist at USC. And yet I really want to emphasize, he is not he's not a lone voice. His work, I think, is particularly cogent. He's got, I think his book, Descartes' Error, is particularly useful if you want to explore these ideas further. And yet he speaks for a broad consensus among neuroscientists and social psychologists. We are in the popular consciousness, the popular sort of sense of the relationship between logical reasoning and emotion is one of antagonism, that logical reasoning and emotions essentially are kind of at war within ourselves. And Damasio's work is exploring the relationship between emotions and asking what purpose do they serve and what role do they specifically play in reasoning. And he emphasizes the relationship is very different than what we often believe to be in popular consciousness. He's making it really clear emotions evolve to support survival. And this is, in some sense, a truism. Kind of one of the core concepts in social psychology is dividing, thinking of emotions in kind of two broad categories: approach and avoid. When a situation, a set of circumstances, evokes positive emotions, we tend to approach it. We're drawn in. And we can see why that obviously, has a role, plays an important role in the perpetuation of the species. And when a situation or a set of circumstances evokes a negative emotion, we tend to want to avoid it. And you can see why that obviously, helps to keep us safe. So emotions play this incredibly productive and necessary role in our survival as a species and in our life as individuals. Now, Damasio, though, is really clear. This idea that we have in the popular consciousness that emotions are this sort of volcanic force that tend to exert that kind of a negative influence on our experience. He says, look, that can happen. Unregulated emotion can lead us astray. Here's how I know from personal experience. I've never opened one of these things and not finished it. At my advanced age, that's not particularly good for me, especially in an era of quarantine. So it's, I want to legitimize this idea that yes, emotions can be extremely problematic, and we do need to figure out how to regulate them and manage them more effectively. But Damasio is really clear. His work and the consensus that he represents among neuroscientists and social psychologists is that emotions actually are integral to reasoning. Emotions play an incredibly important role as an input into the logical reasoning process. Most specifically, he says that emotions are necessary for efficient decision making. This research, the research that he's drawing upon here and presenting, it draws largely on the experiences of people who've suffered traumatic brain injuries, either in the case of something penetrating the skull or in the case of a brain tumor. Which had some specific impacts in the unfortunate people under the study here. Their capacity for logical reasoning, their intelligence was left intact, but they were left unable to feel, unable to register and report on their emotional experience. This work actually began with the quite remarkable experience of an unfortunate man named Phineas Gage back in the 19th century, a railroad worker who suffered a violent accident when a spike was blown through his head as a result of an explosion in a railway work that he was conducting. And he was left intellectually intact. He could conduct his life, but he was left unable to feel, and his life slowly deteriorated over time. Damasio tells the story of one of his patients who suffered a brain tumor that had the same impact. And this unfortunate gentleman would test the same on an IQ test, pre and post his disease, but he lost the ability to feel. And Damasio tells the story of him trying to make a decision about when to schedule his next appointment. Well, if I go Tuesday, I can schedule these errands on the way, but if I go Thursday, then I have to stop and pick up my. He goes down the rabbit hole of this incredible logic tree. He's unable to make use of the large amount of data that is very subtle and available to us as a result of emotions. Victor Johnson, a psychologist at New Mexico State, calls emotions discriminant hedonic amplifiers. I think a particularly kind of useful term in this context. They boost the signals in our mental landscape and allow us to understand what we're going to pay attention to. Bear in mind, it's estimated that we process 10,000 perceptions, sensory inputs that we take in from our sense organs, and proprioceptions, data about the location of our body in space per second. 10,000 of these per second, 63 million in today's class. So how do we figure out what to pay attention to? Well, this is why emotions are attention magnets. So this is the key theme between last week's class and this week's class. And I want you to bear in mind how we began this class with this somewhat distressing experience, this sound that we've evolved, to kind of pay close attention to, that we experience as somewhat distressing. So bearing in mind, a theme also from earlier in the course, many of the sort of aspects of our human psychology that we experience as bugs as individuals are truly features for the species. So this idea that emotions capture our attention and have this profound impact on what we're going to pay attention to, we can experience it. We often experience that as a bug. And yet it's important to remember that it is a feature for the species. Related aspect of this, Joseph Ledoux, really eminent neuroscientist based at NYU, who's best known for his work on the study of the pain circuitry in the brain. He notes that we can think of emotions as a quick and dirty signal. We process, the neural pathways associated with the processing of emotion are literally twice as fast as the neural pathways associated with cognition. And yet, speed has a price. We benefit from, it's a feature that we benefit from the rapid processing of emotions. It allows us to make use of this data very, very quickly, but occasionally it gets us into trouble, particularly when we find ourselves in an interpersonal squabble. This is where the work of Dan Siegel, who is both a researcher and a clinical psychiatrist at UCLA. He's posing the question, well, what's going on in the brain when we lose our mind metaphorically? And here's initially what he's telling us. Here's what's happening. Because the neural pathways associated with the processing of emotion are twice as fast, there's this rapid triggering, and a whole set of behavioral subroutines are click into motion. We have this set of reflexive responses in a given set of circumstances. And yet, it's really important to bear in mind that we can sense our emotions very quickly. We sense that something is happening for us emotionally. We may not be able to identify it. We may not be able to give it a specific label. This is one reason why broadening our emotional vocabulary can be particularly important. We're also, we are wired to pick up other people's emotions at some sense, and yet we do not necessarily comprehend the meaning of the emotion, the nature of the emotion, or the source of the emotion. So we can enter into an interaction with somebody and realize, oh man, something very powerful is being felt here, by myself, by the other person, by myself in response to the other person, and yet we may not be able to make meaning of it. So very important in that context to slow down and be able to regulate our behavior in order to understand exactly what's going on. But this is particularly trouble under certain circumstances. While a theme for this class today is emotion regulation, I'm going to talk specifically about down-regulating negative emotions, which we often experience in a circumstance like this. When we're confronted with something that we perceive as a threat, we have a threat response, more commonly known as a fight, flight, or freeze response. There are manifestations of this on multiple levels. There's this whole cascading constellation of related effects. There are physical manifestations. In the brain, neurotransmitters, specifically adrenaline and cortisol, are released, which optimize us for strength and speed. We can see how when confronted with a literal threat to our physical safety, it's very useful to be optimized for strength and speed. There's also an emotional manifestation of a threat response. We feel fear and anger. And these responses prime us to make snap judgments. Again, when we're confronted with a literal threat to our physical safety, we can see how useful it would be to make snap judgments. Our brain is betting it's going to be more valuable to make a quick decision rather than assessing all the data carefully in order to make the most accurate decision. There's also a cognitive manifestation here. The negativity bias that we carry around with us, the likelihood that we're going to interpret some data as negative is exacerbated. Similarly, though, we're impaired. Our capacity to process information cognitively is impaired. This is very much connected to this emotional manifestation of a threat response. We are primed for snap judgments, and the process, going back to last week, if we think about the necessity of engaging our system to this slow, linear, sequential process of managing data, that's going to get in the way of our ability to make a quick decision. And yet, in a lot of circumstances, we experience what is known as social threat. We have an interaction. We're in a situation engaging with another person, and we experience it as threatening at some level. And the dilemma is that our brain and body responds to some social situations just as if we were facing a literal physical threat to our safety. The same responses kick into gear. The physiological manifestation of a threat response, the emotional manifestation, and the cognitive response. We can see why this would often get us into trouble. What can we do about this? Well, a starting point is proposed in the work of Richard Davidson. Richard Davidson, I think not nearly as well known as he deserves to be. He's one of the country's most eminent neuroscientists based in the University of Wisconsin, one of the first people to consider, to even begin to think about what is happening in the brain during meditation. That led him to actually be one of the first Western scientists to conduct work in Tibet, which led to his relationship with the Dalai Lama. So when the Dalai Lama comes to the United States, he visits Richard Davidson in his lab in Wisconsin. And I emphasize that simply because I think there's a lot of value in Davidson's model, and I'd like us to understand a little bit about where it's coming from, while also providing a caveat around the implications of this model for each of us as individuals, as I do later. Davidson is asking, though, well, what's the neurological basis for emotion? What is happening in the brain? In a more granular way even than Dan Siegel is asking. Well, one of the key findings in Davidson's work is that the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain that we habitually associate with logical reasoning, planning, and decision-making, is intimately involved in emotion. Now, Davidson's work involves essentially running people in and out of fMRI machines, conducting various experiments, and understanding, well, what's happening in different regions of the brain, and he can and making a connection between those results and various emotional manifestations. And what he's found is that emotions are associated with specific neural activity. And one way to characterize it is a relationship between regions of the brain, essentially seeing more activity, more neural activity between different regions of the brain, and noting that, hey, these aspects of the brain that we've habitually associated with cognition, with logical reasoning, are also intimately involved in the emotional process, very consistent with what Damasio began to explore 25, 30 years ago. However, very important to note, all brain regions play a role in emotion. It's important to emphasize how little we still know about the brain and how much the science of the study of what is happening in the brain and how it relates to emotional experience is still very much in its infancy. So I don't want to overemphasize that. There's a lot of unsettled science here, something that concepts that are sufficiently clarified to allow us to understand their implications for us as individuals and begin to experiment with, and yet by no means are we talking about the laws of physics here. Davidson's work resulted in these 6 dimensions of emotional style. And I think one way to think of Davidson's work and his development of this model is essentially kind of going from the inside out. He's looking at different patterns of neurological activity and saying, well, how do those patterns relate to different behaviors? And that resulted in his identification of these 6 dimensions. Let me just take a quick review of them. This dimension of attention, basically the ability to avoid distraction. And if you reflect on the spectrum of Davidson's dimension here, it's, at one end, we're unfocused, prone to distraction. At the other end, hyper-focused, but consequences we may lose the ability to act spontaneously. Next dimension, context sensitivity. Can we discern difference in social environments and act accordingly? At one end, we may have difficulty and may act inappropriately. At the other end, we may be highly sensitive to differences in ways that render us self-conscious or even paralyzed. Outlook. Here, Davidson is talking about the ability to sustain positive emotion. An important the thing to note in his work, even people who are clinically depressed are able to experience positive emotion, but they're unable to sustain it. And from Davidson's perspective, it's largely because of inadequate links in neural networks between the prefrontal cortex, where planning occurs, and the nucleus accumbens, the region of the brain associated with pleasure and reward. At one end, there can be difficulty sustaining positive feelings, but at the other end of the spectrum, we may be so optimistic that we're actually resistant to negative data. We fail to learn from bad experiences. Recovery time, and here I substitute the term recovery time for what Davidson calls resilience, because in a few weeks we'll talk about resilience in a much broader sense using a different model from other social psychologists. Here Davidson's talking very specifically about the speed of recovery from adverse experiences, and recognizing that in some cases, we may be fast to recover, but we could be so fast at the certain end of the spectrum that we fail to register or even learn from setbacks. At the other end of the spectrum, we may be so slow to recover, we feel defeated by even minor setbacks. Self-awareness, and here, really important to emphasize the physiological nature of what Davidson's talking about. He's not talking about in some kind of general abstract sense, do I know myself, but rather, do I literally, physiologically, do I feel myself? Can I perceive the physical aspects of emotion, bearing in mind emotions are physiological events before they register in consciousness? At one end of the spectrum, we can be out of touch and sort of miss the physiological cues that manifest and accompany emotion. At the other end, we can be hypersensitive to them in ways that are actually, again, problematic. And lastly, social intuition. Can we pick up on others' emotional responses? Even though this is a broad human capability, we vary with regard to our effectiveness, again, because of differences in brain structures. At one end, we're so out of touch that we may be puzzled, rendering us incapable of picking up on others' feelings. At the other end, we may be so intuitive, we're, again, in some sense rendered self-conscious or even paralyzed by the impact of others' feelings on us. And of course, I want to provide a caveat. We're about to enter the sequence in the course where we'll be exploring several instruments drawing on neuroscience research and social psychology, but it's important to understand, what is this data? One of my aspirations for you in this course is that you become a better consumer of social psychology and neuroscience research. So when we look at this data, what is it? Well, let's use this as a way of illustrating that. What is this? What is this image? It's easy to say, oh, it's the United States, and yet, of course, a moment's reflection, it makes it very clear it is not the United States. It's a projected image of a digital file, of a photograph, of a map of the United States. It's a proxy of a proxy of a proxy. It's very important to bear that in mind whenever you're looking at any data from any assessment, not only the ones that I'm presenting in this course, but any data that you're presented from assessments anywhere. Here's a nice way to distill that. The map is not the territory it represents. And of course, these results do not represent you in sort of your fullness as an individual. I would like you to get curious when you find that these results present something challenging or disconfirming to you, and especially if you find it triggering. Well, that's not me. That's not who I am. Great. You know yourself better than an assessment will, and I want you to be in the driver's seat. And we all have blind spots, and these assessments may usefully illuminate some of yours. Also, what's the optimal profile? What's the optimal point of any spectrum? And of course, as with so many issues in this course, it's highly contextual. It's going to be very, very subjective based on your circumstances. Guideline here is, does my emotional profile allow me, does it help me in my aspiration to achieve my specific goals in my context? If it does, great. And if it doesn't, are there ways in which I might change it? So I want to tee up a discussion. Part 2 of the class prep that I asked you to consider is, what does this model have to teach me, and what am I making of my results? So with that, I want you to get back with your partner. This doesn't need to be a coaching conversation. I just want you to take 12 minutes and explore these questions. What does this model have to teach me? What am I making of my results? I'll see you back here in 12 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Wherever you are, I'm going to have to ask you to hit pause in your conversations, and I'm going to take a few minutes and address some questions that you posed to me while you were in those conversations and previously. First, just a kind of a very specific question about the distinction between this general concept of mindfulness and what Dan Siegel calls mindsight. I don't make a distinction. I think, while I deeply respect Dr. Siegel's work and the conclusions that he's drawing from it, I think he's using the term mindsight in a way simply to kind of distinguish his work from the general principles. So I don't make a distinction. Question came up: why do I have so many feelings? That actually raises the interesting question of, well, first, how many feelings are there? And here, ask a different social psychologist, you'll get a different answer. There are a number of different models that suggest there are, anywhere from, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 kind of, core primary feelings that can be distinguished from another. Typically it's around 6, but again, there are a variety of different models here, which I think reinforces this point that we've learned quite a lot about how the brain works, and we've learned quite a lot about the nature of emotions, and there is still so much we do not know. So I think the science is very much still in its infancy, and it's unhelpful, I think, to assume, it's not useful to assume that there is kind of some clearly delineated framework that explains all of this. I think that's we tend to get into trouble when we assume that there's some super clearly delineated framework and that the science is so settled that we can absorb it and use it to guide our sort of journey through life. And yet, I think it's settled enough to allow us to draw some conclusions. So what's also very interesting around this sort of the nature of emotions is the extent to which some are inborn, what Damasio calls primary emotions, and others are learned, or what Damasio calls secondary emotions. I mean, some social psychologists, contend, I think an extreme or a more extreme position is that there are no inborn emotions, that everything is socially constructed, everything is learned after birth and is some manifestation of culture. That's a fairly extreme view. There's a more mainstream view is that, yeah, there are a number of core inborn emotions, and yet most of the sort of subtle nuances of the kind of various combinations of emotions are those that we learn after birth as a result of our formative experiences and culture. Question about the role of the internet. To what extent do our online experiences exacerbate our emotional experience? And I would say very, in line with much of what we talked about last week, very significantly. But rather than viewing them as, rather than viewing our online experience as causing, I would view them as designed to capitalize on our emotional mechanisms. I would refer you to the work of Jean Twenge, psychologist at the University of San Diego, or UC San Diego. I know she's in San Diego, but I'm not sure if she's with USD or UCSD. She's done a lot of work on specifically the role of screen time and online experiences for teens, and the role it plays in some cases exacerbating depression. So there's certainly a relationship. Precisely what that relationship is, we are still in the process of exploring. Question about helping people who are depressed or who are experiencing negative emotions around me. First, I go back to one of the earlier points that came up in our first class, drawing on the work of Edgar Schein. Help is useful when it's asked for. So if you're seeking to impose help on somebody who's not asking for your help, be cautious about that. Also, I think very important to make a distinction between clinical depression and sort of periods of gloom that we're all subject to in this state. There's a clinical depression, a form of mental illness. You are unlikely to be able to help someone just by sort of intervening as a friend, colleague, or family member, and yet. There are ways that we can be more or less helpful, and I think a core feature there is empathy. We can often show up with somebody who is in need of help, seeking help, whether they're depressed or not, and essentially encourage them to look on the bright side, or if they're anxious, encouraging them not to worry. It's not going to be that bad. which people often experience as deeply invalidating. This connects with the some of the coaching principles that we talked about in the first class, in which we will come back again and be very important in our upcoming segment on vulnerability. So even just being able to validate what somebody else is feeling may be useful in allowing them to begin to manage those feelings. Also, let's note the importance of talking about feelings as a way of addressing them, which is connected to one of the optional reads for today, and which I'm going to talk about a little bit more briefly. Going specifically to Davidson's model, a question about the relationship between social intuition and empathy. Really the best definition of empathy that I'm aware of is done by work of done by a woman named Teresa Wiseman, who is an expert in nursing and medical care from the UK. Her definition of empathy has a couple of components. It starts with the ability to feel to sense and perceive what somebody else is feeling, but then proceeds into being able to comprehend it, to understand at a cognitive level. Here is what and why they're feeling, and then being able to proactively express it, to convey empathy in such a way that the other person feels empathized with. So the starting point there in Teresa Wiseman's definition is very much aligned with what Davidson's calling social intuition, but empathy transcends that. Simply feeling what somebody else is feeling is insufficient to, I'd say, to actively convey empathy. Question about the distinction between social intuition and context sensitivity. View them as sort of, inverted. Social intuition is very much about what somebody else is feeling. Context sensitivity is really more about what is the environment, which may or may not include what other people are feeling. May be very much connected to the sense of expectation related to culture, other sets of norms that govern what is going to be viewed as appropriate or useful behavior in that context. And then a question about the independence or lack thereof of the emotional dimensions, and what relationship do they have? Are they correlated? Are they orthogonal? And they are very much independent. There is no relationship. This is something that Davidson makes really clear in his readings surrounding the assessment, that starting with this kind of inside out nature of his research, essentially kind of running people in and out of fMRI machines and conducting experiments to associate patterns of neurological activity with specific behaviors and manifestation of emotion. And he saw these 6 dimensions emerge from the research in ways that were entirely independent and not correlated. So even though we might assume, there may be some sort of logical correlation here, that's unlikely. That's not reflected in Davidson's research. I see that there are a number of additional questions. I will explore them in the course of the remainder of the class when I get you into the next conversation with your partner. But I'm going to need to push on in order to ensure that we stay on time. So I will hopefully be able to get to the questions that you posed while I was just speaking now. So let me start this next section of class with a premise. And here I'm just getting on a soapbox, drawing on my experience, my work with my clients, which is that emotion regulation is an essential leadership skill. Your ability to both downregulate your own negative emotions, upregulate your own positive emotions, and have a similar effect on those around you is a critical leadership skill. And I'm not in the least suggesting that our effort here, the intention here is to suppress or deny negative emotions. They're extremely useful, and we'll talk very much about that in the upcoming class on unhappiness. But I'll also recognize, going back to the point that came up in an earlier class, the value of being predictable, the utility of predictable behavior. This is where people who tend to underperform as managers often get into trouble, because they are unable, they're ineffective at regulating their own emotions. They are perceived by the people they're leading and managing as unpredictable. That carries a big cognitive cost. Or they're ineffective at regulating the emotions of others. When they're leading people through a difficult time, as all of my clients are today, they're unable to help people rally and sustain a sense of optimism through that period of difficulty, or they're unable to help people downregulate the difficult emotions of panic or distress, which can certainly come up in today's environment. So I want to put a plug in here for emotion regulation being a leadership skill, not just a skill related to our own individual well-being. Let me talk a little bit about what do I mean by emotion regulation. Again, it's not suppression, it's not control. Let's remind ourselves of the work that we explored last week from Daniel Wegner, who said in his book, White Bears and Other Unwanted Thoughts, limits on willful control are necessary because it's important for emotions to interrupt conscious thought at key moments. In the absence of that capability, the absence of emotions' ability to interrupt and distract us and alert us to a potential threat or potential opportunity, we would be extremely vulnerable. So this is why, once again, emotions are attention magnets. This is a value that they serve. It's I can't emphasize enough. This is a feature for the species that we often experience as a bug. So emotions are usually helpful inputs, but not always. Occasionally, they're a dirty signal. We're going to misperceive what's going on for ourselves or what's going on for somebody else. So we don't want to be able to control our emotions, but we do want to be able to influence them. So what can we do? How can we step into the process of emotion regulation a little bit more effectively? Three kind of buckets of activities. I'm going to lay them out relatively briefly, and then allow you an opportunity to discuss with your partner how you might explore them more fully. First, this idea of lowering the waterline. Here, think about this in the idea of self-awareness in a much broader sense than Davidson talks about with regard to the physiological manifestations of emotion, but rather, do we know ourselves? Davidson's model helps us understand what are my emotional tendencies in a given set of circumstances. How do I tend to react? Is that useful or unhelpful? Siegel and his work in Mindsight helps us understand, well, what are my physiological responses? What does emotion feel like in me? Go back to last week, Kahneman, his work on cognitive biases and the mental models that we bring to a given set of circumstances, which of course have a powerful impact on our emotional experience, a point I'll touch on in a moment. And the starting point, one of the very first concepts that we explored in this course, mindset. This idea that the mental model that I hold about myself and my capabilities and about mistakes and setbacks that I might make or encounter can have also a very powerful impact on my emotional experience. And we're often, especially earlier in our education or our career, we're surrounded by some structures that provide us with a lot of guidance that help us expand our self-awareness, and those structures tend to fall away. How do you continue to do that? This course is one mechanism to allow you to continue to expand your self-awareness and take some of these sub or semi-conscious manifestations of your emotional experience and render them a little bit more visible. What does that look like, though, in the moment when you're seeking to regulate emotions in the moment? Three simple ways to think about that: reframing, self-soothing, and talking about feelings. So reframing, what do I mean by that? Well, the term of art, the technical term from social psychology, is cognitive reappraisal. Here are the leading researchers whose work I'm drawn upon, and they're asking this question: how do our thoughts influence our experience? Well, let's go back to the idea of mental models. The meanings that we assign, the interpretations that we bring to a given situation, to a given set of circumstances, they have a powerful impact on our emotional response. That suggests a powerful point of intervention. If we can reinterpret a given situation, we can shift our emotions. We can't control it, but we can shift our emotions. So again, our mental models shape our experiences, and yet important to bear in mind, our mental models are usually invisible to us. So it's important to identify some practices that will make them a little bit more visible and allow us to be more aware of them. Journaling, coaching, two key factors that I will touch on in a variety of ways in this course, and which will get discussed more further in the optional readings. Self-soothing, let me just say a few words very briefly about this. Term from psychology: physiological modification, active steps to influence our emotional state. We can't control it. There's not a switch here that we can control, but we can influence it. But then also what's known as response modification, active choice in how we express emotion, because we can control our behavior. Some very simple examples. In the grip of a threat response, for example, can we take deeper, slower breaths? Can we slow the rate of respiration that's being accelerated because of our brain and body's response to the given circumstance? Can we sleep more slowly and monitor our tone of voice to have the desired impact on ourselves and others? Can we sense our nonverbals and our body language? Note the importance of attention management here. Here is another connection between last week's class and this week's class. it's extremely difficult when we're in a state of distress, when we're experiencing a threat response, to pay attention to these kind of factors. And yet, if we're able to cultivate a greater capacity for mindfulness and attention management, we can direct a little bit more attention to these kinds of factors, which both allow us to soothe ourselves when we're in the grip of a threat response and needing to downregulate negative emotions, and also have a preferable impact on others. Lastly, talking about feelings. Term from psychology is affect labeling, understanding our emotional affect and giving it a label. What we know from some really interesting fMRI research is that talking about feelings when we're in the midst of a negative emotion, it disrupts that negative emotion. It dramatically diminishes the neural activity in the regions of the brain associated with negative emotion. Also important to note that talking about what we're feeling with somebody else in the moment, much more powerful and efficient than merely thinking about emotion. Bear in mind, this is particularly useful because there are certain circumstances when we're in the midst of some negative emotions we want to downregulate. We can kind of hit pause and take a step back and reflect, go for a walk. There are lots of circumstances in which we can't. And our ability to stop and say in the moment with somebody, this conversation is getting a little stressful, or it feels like things are getting a little heated here. Maybe we can slow things down. Just something like that, a very light touch to be able to talk about what we're feeling allows us to downregulate negative emotions much more effectively. This doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen spontaneously. It takes some practice. It also takes a supportive culture. You don't get to just kind of walk into any interaction, any relationship, any organization and start talking about your feelings. And yet, important to look for pockets of agency. Where can I make it okay to talk about feelings in the moment? This is very, very related to why I emphasize the social nature. This class really has to be built on your interpersonal experiments, both extracting, ideas from the class that you want to experiment with, and then putting those experiments into practice and testing those hypotheses. Also, building capacity. How do we build our capacity for emotion regulation? Well, this is another connection with last week's class. You might remember this guy and the idea of getting messy. Again, the very last time I will inflict a cheesy acronym on you. Stands for these 4 key practices. Talked a little bit about mindfulness last week, and here drawing very much on the work of Dan Siegel and recognizing that his term mindsight is really a way of specifying this very kind of open-ended definition: non-judgmental awareness and acceptance of experience. Dan Siegel does say, look, can we be open? Because we are often, we're particularly attached to a given outcome. And if we're not experiencing that outcome, if the situation is not going the way we want it to, that can, trigger a very strong and sometimes unhelpful emotional response. Can we be less attached to a given experience or given outcome, and which, of course, extremely difficult in an era of COVID-19, but even just being mindful of, well, what am I attached to? And in what ways might my desire for that attachment be counterproductive? Observation. And here Siegel's talking about the ability to observe ourselves, to step out of our immediate experience. Lastly, objectivity, recognizing that having a feeling does not mean being a feeling. And that it's also based on this ability to step outside of our immediate emotional experience and see ourselves more fully. Meditation is, as Siegel recommends and as Davidson recommends, and as I mentioned last week, the most powerful self-coaching tool, the most I think, effective way to begin to expand our capacity for emotion regulation. But there are also alternatives. What we know from research is that journaling can be quite useful as a way of distilling what we're thinking and rendering it concrete. And yet what I know from my practice is that people habitually fail to do it, even though there's a lot of research indicating its utility. Certain forms of exercise can be useful. Any practice that promotes reflection, very, very valuable to kind of build into our lives, especially in an era of COVID-19. There's also interesting research showing that 1 hour a week in nature is a way to further cultivate our capacity for emotion regulation by expanding our state of mindfulness. And I would say that that's both harder to accomplish in an era of COVID-19, which may also render it all the more important. So I'd encourage you to look for those opportunities. Let me say a little bit briefly about these other practices, though. Exercise. A point I made very early on is that it's important not to view mind-body integration as some sort of hippie bullshit. There's a lot of data that shows the particular value of regular physical exercise for our ability to sense, perceive, and regulate our emotions. bear in mind the starting point here is that emotions are physiological events before they register in consciousness. This is why Davidson's research shows that regular physical activity allows us to be more self-aware in his very specific definition of being able to perceive the physiological manifestations of emotion well before they register in consciousness. Sleep hygiene. This is a topic that comes up all the time in my practice. It's something I talk about with clients every week and almost every day. And drawing on research here, which shows that when we are sleep deprived, our capacity for emotion regulation is lower and we experience higher anxiety as a result. We're less effective at our ability to manage not only our own emotions, but to impact those of others. Some really interesting work by a guy named Christopher Barnes. He's a psychologist at the University of Washington, who's previously at the Air Force Academy, where he did work that showed that officers who were habitually sleep deprived were perceived as less inspiring by their troops. So if you think about emotion regulation, not just with regard to, like, hey, how can I affect my own emotional experience, but can I usefully affect those of others? Can I downregulate other people's negative emotions, or can I upregulate their positive emotions when I want them to feel rallied or inspired? Critical to recognize that sleep is a foundation that allows us to do that. And stress reduction. And here I'm saying, talking very specifically about a distinction between chronic stress, low-level forms of distress that we experience over the course of a given ordinary day. That's distinguished from acute stress, a very, very profound and dramatic, difficult experience that we're going through. The low-level chronic stress results in changes in neural structures, and a consequence is a reduced ability to downregulate threat response. So if we look at our daily lives, if we are commuting, and many of us are not, because we are trapped in a sort of work from home environment, and many of us are having to commute now. What is the work environment, whether we're at home or outside the home? Thinking about how we use our phones, which draws very much on the work we did last week. And when we leave the home, thinking about the first 30 minutes after we return. All of these can be, and what I know from my practice, can be very powerful sources of low-level chronic stress. Can we look at our environment from these different perspectives and ask if there are changes we could make that might diminish the levels of chronic stress we experience, with the goal of expanding our capacity for emotion regulation. So with that, I want to transition and get you back into a conversation with your partner. Last set of preparation questions I asked you to reflect on were, what helps me regulate my emotion and what experiments might I run? I'd like you to draw on some of the ideas that I just proposed, while recognizing there's a long menu there. You may not have these ideas readily in mind, but if you can start to craft some hypotheses about what might make a difference for your ability to have an impact on your capacity for emotion regulation, and allow your partner to help you craft some experiments. So with that, I'm going to have it take 16 minutes. I'm encouraging you to be rigorous about the coaching process. You got 8 minutes for person A to coach person B, then switch 8 minutes for person B to coach person A. What helps me regulate my emotions and what experiments might I run? I'll see you back here in 16 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Um, Before we move on, I want to remind you to please, in some way, shape, or form, remember to thank your partner. Express some gratitude and appreciation for this person who's going through this experience with you. And let me just take a few minutes and respond to the questions that came up earlier in the input. First, somebody said, hey, speak up because I'm not able to hear you as clearly as I would like. So I will endeavor to do that. Question about how to change along the dimensions of emotional style. And hopefully some of the topics that I talked about under that messy framework are useful, but I want to emphasize mindfulness and meditation. So Davidson's work really emphasizes the power, the utility of meditation as a way to shift where we are along any dimension of emotional style, if we feel like it would be helpful to allow us to achieve our goals. Chapter 11 in his book it talks more specifically about that, but the overarching recommendation is meditate. Several questions about the balance between addressing everything in the moment versus sweeping it under the rug. If we have a negative emotional response to something, if we feel the need to unpack it at any given moment, that can become quite overwhelming to the people around us and to us. And yet, if we sit on stuff, that may also be counterproductive, certainly in the long run. First, how we address it is key. How we step into a conversation about a difficult experience or something that we're having a negative response to. So paying close attention to the language that we're using, paying close attention to the timing, the moments at which we step into these conversations. There are a lot of resources on my site related to feedback, related to sharing feedback more effectively in ways that are going to be experienced by the other person more productively, which has a lot to do with emotion regulation, being able to downregulate our negative emotional response to have a more cogent, easier conversation. And yet, by the same token, I would also emphasize sometimes work in this domain, can have the impact of sort of privileging the subjective emotional experience. We can come out of work like this saying, my feelings are the most important thing, and I'm having a bad feeling in response to this. And while I'm certainly a big believer in understanding, what we're feeling and leveraging those emotions as useful data, I want to put in a plug for counteracting some of this privileging of the subjective emotional experience. Sometimes when we're having a negative emotional response to somebody, it can really just be a manifestation of our desire for something or someone to be different, which can be a manifestation of our need for control, which may be particularly important these days when we feel a loss of agency, we feel a lack of control. So rather than just directing, certainly important to figure out, how do I give this feedback more effectively to have the desired effect? But also, especially in personal circumstances, rather than just directing that feedback at the other person, I think also important, and I think much of the work around mindfulness and meditation specifically encourages us to look inward and say, can I regulate my own emotional response? Because simply finding more effective ways to give feedback may just perpetuate this idea of privileging the subjective emotional experience. Question about self-perception. If I have a blind spot, can I trust this data? Well, I would encourage you to get other people to take this assessment for you and say, hey, I'd like you to use this assessment as a lens. If you were to respond, to these questions with me in mind, what would you say? That can be essentially a way of kind of performing a 360 on yourself. When I've done some version of that, the results have been quite illuminating. A couple of repeated questions about, hey, are these dimensions in Davidson's model correlated? Because it seems like they should be. Definitively, no. That's there's nothing in his work that suggests any correlation. That said, we may experience them as related in ourselves. This goes back to the idea that the map is not the territory. We may sense a relationship in ourselves between some of these dimensions, especially in certain situations that tend to evoke a similar response. Series of questions about the relationship between social intuition and context sensitivity in Davidson's model, because they both seem to be related to responding to external circumstances. And I think it's the nature of those circumstances. Context sensitivity may have nothing to do with other individuals and their response to us. In Davidson's work, he talks about the example of a veteran who's experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. And and in whom the sound of a car backfiring, provoked a profound threat response and sent him into a panic attack. That is an example of essentially neurological dysfunction, which is the consequence of a heightened sensitivity to sort of surrounding circumstances. Has nothing to do with an individual, has nothing to do with other people's feelings, but it has to do with the environment. You could imagine, I don't know, walking into an auditorium before you're about to give a speech before an audience. Let's assume this is in the future when that sort of thing happens once again. That setting may evoke a surge of emotions. Oh wow, I'm going to be on stage in front of hundreds of people, but nobody's in the room. You're just in that environment and very sensitive to that particular situation and what it evokes in you. Secondarily, you may be in the room giving a talk to people, and you may pick up on what other people are feeling in response to your remarks. So it's really distinguishing the environment and our understanding of what is appropriate behavior and other people's feelings in the moment. Question about the impact of COVID-19 and the extent to which living under these very unusual circumstances shifts any of our responses. Absolutely. And first, let me just kind of take a step back and say any psychological assessment that is proposing to kind of illuminate some, perpetual, unchanging part of your psychology, I would be very skeptical about. We are extremely contextual. We are extremely contingent, and how we respond to a given situation has so much to do about that context. So everything that I'm going to be asking to explore very much, is highly contextual. So the results that you're experiencing right now will absolutely be influenced by, the situation that we've been living under for the past 6 weeks. There were additional questions, but I do want to push on in order to keep my promise of keeping ending on time. I will, in my follow-up email this week, send you a link to the archive for my Stanford course, my Stanford version of this course, which I historically have taught in person, but I'm now teaching online also, includes a number of links to additional resources that might allow you to explore, especially in regard to mindfulness, exercise, and sleep, specific practices and recommendations that would allow you to consider how your investment in those practices could influence your ability to regulate emotions more effectively. With that, let me just offer a summation and a few thoughts for next time. I would like you to consider your current emotional style as influenced by the circumstance we find ourselves living in, and what is working for you and what is not. Davidson makes really clear there is no normative profile here. There's no normative point on any one spectrum. There are pros and cons to every point on the spectrum. And you may want to consider, well, what changes might be useful? What changes might allow me to accomplish my goals a little bit more effectively in the life circumstances that I find myself in? This idea of lowering the waterline to increase my self-awareness. My hope is that these for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be exploring a series of assessments that they usefully illuminate some parts of yourself that are typically not visible. And after this course, I'd like you to think about how else might I get that perspective, and emphasizing, again, journaling and coaching as ways of getting ourselves having ourselves reflected back to us in the form of our concrete observations or in the form of somebody else's perceptions. So can I practice acting in the moment? There are steps that we can take in the moment, not to control, but to influence, to regulate our emotional response. And can I build the capacity by investing in these practices, which we cannot kind of turn on like a switch, but we must invest over a period of time leading up to some of the difficulties we might experience. Okay, for next time, very briefly, I'll say for our upcoming class on happiness, you're going to encounter the pie chart, which is at this point well known to many of you, I'm sure, if not most of you. And I want you to be very careful. This chart that purports to talk about sources of well-being it's often misunderstood, and make sure that you do understand it. It can be misleading. That's why I've wrote about it in a way that really tries to deconstruct some of the myths. I'm going to ask you to conduct 2 exercises. The first is called an activity fit diagnostic, drawing on the work of Sonia Lubomirsky. The PDF that is on the course website is the same as the, if you choose to read, if you explore the optional reading in Liba Mirsky, which is not on the site, but many folks have this book available. If you want to pursue it, it's the same diagnostic, as the same test as in the reading. It's just easier to score. And a survey. This is called the Values in Action Survey of Character Strengths. It's an online assessment. I provide an introduction because I want you to take it with some context that helps frame it. I also provide a follow-up to help you start to understand what to make of this data. So after you take the assessment, make sure you go back to my post and read the follow-up. It takes about 20 minutes, 120 questions. Be honest with yourself. If this assessment in particular lends itself to a framing of a right answer. And if you look to, game the results to get what feels good, the data is going to be less useful to you. Video will be up on my site along with these slides by the end of today. Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time out of your morning to spend it with me. It's 11:30. I've kept my promise. I hope you have a good rest of the weekend. I will look forward to seeing you next week.